Europeans have never known how to do history. Not in the way the rest of the world meant it. Not as memory, not as accountability, not as continuity. What they mastered instead was historical curation, selective preservation of power's self-image. Let's look at the record. By 2500 BCE, the Indus Valley Civilization had urban planning, plumbing, and engraved seals, used to track trade, rituals, and governance. They weren't writing epic poems about themselves. They were documenting systems. In Mesopotamia, Sumerians carved debt, flood patterns, harvest yields, and civic ordinances into clay. Not because they sought glory, but because they knew power had to be remembered, or it would be abused. In Kemet or ancient Egypt, priests and scribes developed chronological dynasties, tied to cosmic events, agricultural rhythms, and moral judgment in the afterlife. The past wasn't abstract. It was encoded into ethics. In pre-colonial West Africa, griots preserved oral histories so detailed they could trace clan disputes back centuries, reciting names, betrayals, and migrations. They didn't write to dominate time. They spoke to keep it alive. Meanwhile, in Europe, the first recorded histories are myths of conquest and divine right. Homer's epics, written around 800 BCE, were not records. They were national origin stories, filled with gods and bloodlines. When Europeans finally start writing down dates, they don't use them for accountability. They use them to create chronologies of exceptionalism. Rome as empire, the church as timekeeper, the Renaissance as a rebirth. Of what? Whose death? And enlightenment as the moment history becomes European by default. Every other timeline gets called prehistory. That's the trick. Anything not written by them, in their script, on their parchment, gets labeled myth, folklore, primitive. Even when it tracked stars better than Galileo. Even when it mapped genealogies more faithful than any feudal archive. Ask the British Museum why they own more Nigerian bronzes than Nigeria. Ask the Vatican Library why no one can see the Ethiopian texts it hoards. Ask France how many manuscripts it took from Timbuktu, and why its archives begin the moment African memory is put in French. Europeans don't document to remember. They document to own, to timestamp their theft, to write the receipt in Latin so no one else can contest the price. Compare that to Maya codices, mathematical, astronomical, cyclical. History was not linear. It was seasonal, karmic, recorded to align human behavior with the cosmos. Spain burned them, then told the world that the Maya had no written language. Compare that to Andean quipus, color-coded chords used to track trade, population, and ritual. No ink, no paper, no alphabet, but enough information to run an empire. What did the Spanish say? These are not real records, then destroyed them. In China, dynastic chronicles included corruption, court scandal, uprisings, and ecological disaster. Even the emperor wasn't above critique. That's not narrative. That's institutional memory. In Islamic historiography, scholars like Ibn Khaldun traced economic systems, climate, and social cycles not to mythologize, but to explain how power rises and collapses. Europe wouldn't develop that kind of analysis for another 700 years. Europeans didn't invent history. They invented historical distortion, turning archives into propaganda, calling museums preservation, calling oral cultures illiterate, calling spiritual cosmologies pre-modern, turning discovery into time-stamped denial. What they call history is actually a maintenance system, a ritual to keep power centered, clean, and innocent. That's why their textbooks always start with Greece, skip 1,000 years, and resume when Europe started looting everyone else. They call that the modern era. We call it what it was. A global memory crisis. Engineered, curated, rebranded. Real history remembers the wound. European history remembers the spotlight. That's why the archive looks like a crime scene. That's why the footnotes read like alibis. That's why they burned libraries while calling themselves the keepers of knowledge. If you want history, don't ask who wrote it. Ask who survived it, and what they had to forget just to be heard. Because Europeans didn't give us history. They gave us the edited trailer and buried the full film under rubble, ashes, and copyright. Cope.